They forced her to remove her jacket in front of everyone at the Fort Meridian Recreation Center, laughing at what they assumed was stolen valor. What they didn't know was that the combat patch on her shoulder told a story that would leave a colonel speechless and transform their mockery into stunned silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Welcome to Military Moments. From which military base or hometown are you watching this video today? If you enjoy stories of hidden courage and unexpected moments of recognition, consider subscribing to join our community of those who honor true service. The October evening air carried the crisp bite of approaching winter across Fort Meridian, nestled in the rolling hills of central Tennessee. The military installation buzzed with its usual rhythm of controlled activity, vehicles moving with purpose along tree-lined roads, personnel heading to evening chow, and the distant echo of a bugle call marking the end of another day. Captain Lydia Hartwell moved through this familiar choreography like someone who belonged yet somehow remained apart from it all. At 42, she carried herself with the measured gait of someone who had learned to navigate the world carefully, though few would guess the reasons why. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, streaked now with premature silver that spoke of experiences beyond her years. The Fort Meridian Recreation Center stood as one of the base's newer additions, its modern glass and steel facade gleaming under the security lights. Inside, the Friday evening crowd had gathered for the weekly social mixer, a tradition that brought together active duty personnel, dependents, and the small community of military retirees who had chosen to remain in the area after their service ended. Lydia approached the entrance wearing a simple black military-style jacket, unremarkable except for its obviously civilian cut in the absence of any visible rank or unit insignia. The fabric showed signs of regular wear but careful maintenance, the kind of garment that suggested its owner valued practicality over fashion. She paused briefly at the glass doors, her reflection showing a woman who might easily be mistaken for a military spouse or civilian contractor, someone with connections to the military world, but not necessarily a warrior herself. The Recreation Center's main hall buzzed with conversation and the clink of glasses. Round tables dotted the space, occupied by various groups engaged in the comfortable camaraderie that formed the backbone of military social life. Near the entrance, a registration table manned by enthusiastic volunteers collected names and affiliations from arriving guests. "Name and unit affiliation?" asked the young soldier behind the table, his specialist rank clearly visible on his uniform. His name tag read Patterson, and his eager demeanor suggested someone still new enough to the military to find these social functions genuinely exciting. "Lydia Hartwell," she replied quietly, her voice carrying the slight rasp that came from years of breathing desert sand and vehicle exhaust. "I'm recently separated. Still transitioning." Patterson's expression shifted to the practiced sympathy military personnel reserved for those navigating the often difficult process of leaving service. "Well, you're welcome here. There's a good mix tonight: active duty, retirees, families. The bar's open, and there's a buffet along the back wall." Lydia nodded her thanks and moved into the crowd, immediately sensing the subtle social calculations that occurred at such gatherings. Groups naturally formed along invisible lines of rank, unit affiliation, and length of service. She moved toward a quieter corner, content to observe rather than immediately integrate into any particular circle. The jacket she wore had been carefully chosen for its anonymity. Unlike the distinctive uniforms that immediately proclaimed rank and accomplishments, civilian clothing allowed her to move through military social situations without the automatic categorization that governed most interactions on base. It was a freedom she had come to appreciate during her months of transition, though it also carried an unexpected isolation. At a table near the center of the room, A group of young officers had claimed territory with the confident expansiveness of those accustomed to being noticed. Their conversation carried the animated energy of people discussing recent training exercises, upcoming deployments, and the complex social dynamics of military leadership. Among them, Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Thornfield held court with the natural authority of someone whose career had been marked by steady advancement and recognition. Thornfield was a striking woman in her late 30s, her blonde hair perfectly styled even at the end of a long duty day. Her dress blue uniform bore the ribbons and badges of someone whose service had been both distinguished and highly visible airborne wings. Ranger tab, multiple combat deployments clearly displayed across her chest. She spoke with the confident cadence of someone accustomed to having her opinions carry weight. The problem with the transition process, Thornfield was saying to her tablemates, is that it attracts people who want to maintain their connection to military culture without having actually earned it. You see it all the time: contractors, spouses, even some veterans who inflate their service record once they're out. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her comments drew nods from the younger officers at the table, most of whom were still early enough in their careers to be impressed by Thornfield's combination of rank and combat experience. Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos, recently returned from his second deployment to Afghanistan, leaned forward with interest. "I've noticed that too, ma'am," Santos agreed. "Especially at events like this. People show up wearing military-style clothing, trying to blend in. But you can usually tell who actually served and who's just playing dress-up." From her position across the room, Lydia could hear fragments of the conversation, though she made no effort to move closer or join in. She had attended the social mixer on the recommendation of her transition counselor, who had suggested that maintaining connections to the military community might ease her adjustment to civilian life. So far, the evening felt more like an anthropological study of a culture she was no longer certain she belonged to. The irony was not lost on her that these conversations about authentic military identity were taking place just yards from where she stood, unrecognized and uncategorized. Her jacket, chosen precisely for its ability to avoid drawing attention, had succeeded perhaps too well. In a room full of people eager to display their military credentials, her deliberate anonymity made her nearly invisible. Lydia moved toward the buffet table, navigating between clusters of conversation with the automatic situational awareness that never fully left those who had served in hostile environments. As she reached for a plate, she became aware that the discussion at Thornfield's table had grown louder, their assessment of authentic military culture becoming more pointed. "The worst ones," Thornfield continued, her voice carrying clearly across the nearby tables, "are the ones who show up to military events wearing gear they have no right to wear. It's disrespectful to those of us who actually earned our place here." The comment seemed directed at the room in general, but Lydia felt the weight of casual judgment that had become familiar during her months of transition. In choosing anonymity, she had unknowingly positioned herself as exactly the type of person Thornfield was describing, someone whose military credentials were not immediately visible, whose right to participate in military social life was therefore questionable. As she filled her plate with minimal attention to the selections, Lydia reflected on the strange position she occupied in this familiar yet foreign world. The ease with which she had once moved through military social situations now felt like a skill she was slowly losing, replaced by a hyper-awareness of how others perceived her uncertain status. The evening stretched ahead with the promise of more such moments: casual assessments, subtle challenges to her right to belong, and the constant weight of deciding whether and how to reveal the truth about her service. For now, she remained content to observe from the margins, though something in the tone of Thornfield's conversation suggested that her anonymity might not last much Longer. The conversation at Lieutenant Colonel Thornfield's table grew more animated as the evening progressed. Their discussion of military authenticity drawing the attention of nearby groups. What had started as casual commentary was evolving into something more pointed, with Thornfield clearly enjoying her role as arbiter of military legitimacy. "You can always spot them," Thornfield declared, gesturing with her drink toward the room in general. "The posture's wrong, the haircut's too civilian, and they wear military-style clothing without understanding what any of it actually means." Staff Sergeant Santos nodded enthusiastically, eager to contribute to a conversation led by such a senior officer. "My cousin does that, ma'am. Never served a day, but he wears combat boots and tactical gear to make people think he's military. It's embarrassing." Captain Derek Nolan, an intelligence officer recently assigned to Fort Meridian, leaned into the discussion. "The psychological profile is interesting. They want the respect and recognition that comes with military service without actually earning it. Classic stolen valor mentality." From her position near the buffet table, Lydia continued to listen with growing discomfort. The conversation felt increasingly like a public tribunal, with Thornfield and her companions appointing themselves as judges of who belonged in military spaces. She considered leaving. The transition counselor's advice about maintaining community connections suddenly seemed less valuable than avoiding potential confrontation. But as she turned to go, Thornfield's voice carried clearly across the room, now loud enough that multiple tables were listening. "Take that woman over there, for example," Thornfield said. And Lydia realized with a sinking feeling that she had become the subject of their analysis. Military-style jacket, but look at how she carries herself. No unit affiliation, no visible rank, probably no real service record either. The comment created a ripple of attention throughout the nearby area. Conversations quieted as people turned to look, creating the kind of public spectacle that Lydia had spent months trying to avoid. She felt the familiar tension in her shoulders that came with being assessed as a potential threat, though in this case, the threat was to social order rather than physical safety. Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, a recent West Point graduate still adjusting to her first assignment, looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Ma'am, maybe we shouldn't." "Shouldn't what?" Thornfield interrupted. "Call out people who are disrespecting our community? This is exactly the kind of passive acceptance that allows stolen valor to flourish." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, creating an atmosphere of tension that spread beyond Thornfield's immediate circle. Other conversations had largely stopped now, with most of the room's attention focused on the developing confrontation. Lydia found herself at the center of a social storm she had neither sought nor prepared for. Santos stood up from his chair, emboldened by Thornfield's leadership and apparently eager to demonstrate his own commitment to military values. "Ma'am, should we ask her to verify her military status? It's our responsibility to protect the integrity of military social events." The suggestion drew murmurs of approval from some quarters and uncomfortable shifting from others. The evening's social mixer was transforming into something resembling a public trial, with Lydia cast as the defendant in a case she didn't fully understand. Thornfield's eyes locked onto Lydia's across the room, her expression showing the cold satisfaction of someone who enjoyed exercising authority. "I think that's an excellent idea, Sergeant Santos. Military social events are for military personnel and their families. If she can't verify her status, she doesn't belong here." Captain Nolan looked uncertain, clearly recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond casual conversation. "Ma'am, maybe there's a more private way to handle this?" "Privacy is what allows fraudulent behavior to continue," Thornfield replied sharply. "Public accountability is necessary. If she has legitimate military credentials, she should be proud to share them." The logic was seductive in its simplicity, and Lydia could see several people nodding in agreement. In a community built on shared sacrifice and earned recognition, the idea of protecting that exclusivity resonated strongly. What they couldn't know was that her reluctance to share her credentials had nothing to do with fraud, and everything to do with operations that officially didn't exist. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, an MP with 2 deployments to Iraq, joined the growing circle of officers around Thornfield's table. "I've seen this before at veteran events. People show up claiming service they never performed, sometimes even wearing medals they didn't earn. It's insulting to those of us who actually deployed." The comment drew strong agreement from the group, reinforcing their sense of righteous purpose. What had started as casual commentary was now becoming a mission to protect military honor. With Lydia unwillingly cast as the threat they needed to neutralize, across the room, Lydia remained motionless, weighing her options with the same careful calculation she had once applied to much more dangerous situations. She could leave, avoiding confrontation, but confirming their suspicions. She could engage verbally, trying to deflect without revealing classified information. Or she could stand her ground and face whatever came next. The choice was made for her when Santos began walking across the room toward her, his movement drawing the attention of the entire gathering. The casual social atmosphere had completely evaporated, replaced by the tense energy of a community preparing to defend itself against a perceived intruder. "Excuse me, miss," Santos said as he approached, his tone carrying the official courtesy that military personnel used when conducting unpleasant but necessary duties. "Lieutenant Colonel Thornfield would like to speak with you about your military status." The words carried clearly in the now quiet room, making it impossible for anyone to pretend they weren't witnessing a public challenge. Lydia looked around at the faces watching her, some curious, some supportive of Thornfield's aggressive approach, others clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation. "I'm just here for the social mixer," Lydia replied quietly, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "I wasn't aware that attending required a security clearance verification." Her response drew a few nervous chuckles from the crowd, but Thornfield's expression hardened at what she apparently perceived as evasiveness. "Military social events are for military personnel," Thornfield called out from across the room, her voice carrying the authority of command. "If you've served, you should be proud to say so. If you haven't, you don't belong here." The ultimatum was clear, and the room waited for Lydia's response. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes assessing her, cataloging every detail of her appearance and demeanor for signs of deception or authenticity. The irony was that her very reluctance to display her credentials was being interpreted as evidence that she had none to display. Confrontation had reached a point where backing down would be interpreted as admission of guilt, while standing firm would likely escalate the situation beyond anything she was prepared to handle in a public setting. Around her, she could see people pulling out phones, documenting what they apparently expected to become a significant incident. The judgment phase was complete. In the court of public opinion, she had already been found guilty of the crime of insufficient military authenticity. Now came the moment when she would have to decide how to respond to a verdict she had never had the chance to. Lydia stood perfectly, still as the weight of expectation pressed down on her from every corner of the recreation center. The silence stretched long enough that she could hear the ventilation system humming overhead and the distant sound of a radio playing in the kitchen area. Every face in the room was turned toward her, creating an amphitheater of judgment that would have intimidated most people into either flight or aggressive defense. Instead, she maintained the same measured composure she had carried since entering the building. Her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing steady and controlled. Years of operating in environments where a single wrong reaction could mean death had taught her the value of stillness under pressure. What others might interpret as nervousness or guilt was actually the practiced calm of someone who had learned to think clearly when stakes were highest. "I appreciate your concern for military integrity," Lydia said finally, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet room without being raised. "That's something we should all take seriously." The response was perfectly calibrated, acknowledging their stated concern without conceding their authority to challenge her or agreeing to their demands for verification. She moved slightly to face Thornfield directly, a subtle shift that demonstrated respect for rank while not showing submission to the public tribunal that had formed around her. Santos remained standing nearby, clearly uncertain about how to proceed when his target refused to behave according to the script he had expected. He glanced back at Thornfield for guidance, but the lieutenant colonel was studying Lydia with the focused attention of someone trying to decode an unexpected response. "That's not really an answer," Thornfield replied, her tone sharpening as she recognized that her authority was not having its intended effect. "Military social events require proper credentials. If you can't provide them, you need to leave." Around the room, people shifted uncomfortably as the confrontation escalated. What had begun as entertainment was becoming something harder to watch, a public humiliation that many were starting to recognize as potentially unjust. Several people near the back of the room exchanged glances that suggested growing unease with Thornfield's aggressive approach. Lydia nodded once, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both understanding and complete lack of compliance. "I understand your position," she said, "but I'm here as a guest of the installation, same as everyone else. My invitation came through proper channels." The statement was technically accurate. Her transition counselor had arranged her attendance through official military family services, but it sidestepped the question of her own military status entirely. More importantly, it demonstrated a familiarity with military bureaucracy that suggested someone who understood how these systems actually work. Captain Nolan shifted in his seat, his intelligence training making him more sensitive to verbal precision than some of his colleagues. There was something about Lydia's word choice and tone that didn't match the profile of someone trying to perpetrate fraud. Her responses showed the kind of careful thought that came from experience with situations where words carried serious consequences. "Proper channels don't matter if you're misrepresenting yourself," Rodriguez interjected from her position near Thornfield's table. "Stolen valor is a federal crime. We have a responsibility to report it." The accusation of criminal activity raised the stakes considerably, transforming what had been social pressure into something approaching an official investigation. Several people in the crowd looked shocked at the escalation, while others nodded approval at Rodriguez's hardline stance. The room was clearly divided between those who supported the aggressive challenge and those who were becoming uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation. Lydia absorbed the criminal accusation with the same steady calm she had shown throughout the encounter. Her military bearing became more pronounced under pressure, shoulders squared, spine straight, feet positioned in a stable stance that spoke of countless hours of formation training. The irony was that her comportment under fire was demonstrating exactly the kind of military conditioning that her challengers claimed she lacked. "I haven't misrepresented anything," she replied evenly. "I've simply chosen not to discuss my background with strangers at a social event." The distinction was important, and several people in the room seemed to recognize it. There was a difference between claiming false credentials and declining to provide real ones. Though Thornfield's group appeared determined not to acknowledge that difference, Lieutenant Walsh, who had remained quiet during most of the confrontation, finally spoke up from her position at the edge of Thornfield's circle. "Ma'am, maybe we should consider that there might be reasons someone wouldn't want to discuss their service record publicly." The comment drew sharp looks from Thornfield and Santos, but it also created space for others who had been uncomfortable with the aggressive approach to voice their own concerns. A murmur of agreement rippled through parts of the crowd, suggesting that not everyone supported the public tribunal that had developed. What reasons? Thornfield demanded, her tone making it clear that she considered Walsh's intervention unwelcome. Pride in service should make someone eager to share their accomplishments, not hide them. Lydia could see Walsh struggling with how to respond without directly contradicting her superior officer. The young lieutenant was clearly uncomfortable with the situation but constrained by military hierarchy from expressing that discomfort too directly. Some operations require ongoing security considerations. Walsh said carefully. Classification levels, unit assignments, deployment locations, there are legitimate reasons for discretion. The observation was astute and drew nods from several people who had experience with classified operations. But it also seemed to irritate Thornfield, who appeared to view any defense of Lydia as a challenge to her authority. Convenient excuse, Thornfield replied dismissively. But classification doesn't prevent someone from acknowledging basic military service. Unit, rank, years of service, that's all public information. She turned back to Lydia with renewed determination. So let's start simple. What unit did you serve with? The question hung in the air like a trap, designed to force Lydia into either lying or revealing information she clearly preferred to keep private. Around the room, conversations had completely stopped as people waited to see how she would respond to the direct challenge. Lydia considered her options with the same methodical approach she had once used to evaluate tactical situations. She could provide generic information that would satisfy casual curiosity without revealing classified details. She could continue deflecting, though that approach was clearly losing effectiveness. Or she could find a way to redirect the confrontation entirely. I'm curious, she said finally, turning the conversation in an unexpected direction. What makes someone qualified to verify another person's military credentials? Is that an official duty assignment, or just something we're making up as we go along? The question was posed with genuine interest rather than hostility, but it had the effect of highlighting the unofficial nature of the tribunal that had formed around her. Several people in the crowd looked thoughtful, apparently considering for the first time whether Thornfield actually had any authority to demand the verification she was insisting on. Santos looked uncertain for the first time since the confrontation began. His eagerness to support a senior officer was running up against the realization that they might be operating outside any official protocol. Military personnel were trained to follow proper procedures, and the impromptu investigation they had launched didn't seem to fit any official framework. We have a responsibility to our community, Thornfield said. But her voice lacked some of its earlier certainty. Military spaces should be protected from those who don't belong here. Absolutely, Lydia agreed, her tone suggesting complete sincerity. The question is whether this particular approach accomplishes that goal, or just creates division where none existed before. Her response demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of group dynamics and leadership principles that impressed several people in the crowd. Rather than defending herself directly, she had redirected the conversation toward the broader question of how military communities should police themselves, a topic that revealed her familiarity with military culture. Even as she avoided discussing her own credentials, the exchange had subtly shifted the dynamic in the room. What had begun as a straightforward challenge to someone's right to belong had evolved into a more complex discussion about authority, procedure, and community standards. Lydia had managed to maintain her dignity while demonstrating exactly the kind of thoughtful leadership that genuine military experience produced. Thornfield seemed to recognize that her position was becoming less secure, but she was too committed to the confrontation to back down gracefully. The evening had become a test of wills between two very different approaches to military culture, one based on aggressive gatekeeping and the other on quiet confidence. The Room waited to see which approach would ultimately prevail. The momentary uncertainty in Thornfield's voice seemed to trigger something deeper in her personality, a need to reassert dominance when her authority was questioned. She stood up from her chair with deliberate precision, her dress blue uniform catching the overhead lights as she moved toward the center of the room. The gesture commanded attention and reestablished her as the focal point of the confrontation. "I think we've had enough philosophical discussion," Thornfield announced, her voice carrying the crisp authority of command. "This is very simple. Military social events are for military personnel. If you can't or won't verify your status, then you're admitting you don't belong here." The ultimatum was delivered with finality that left little room for continued deflection. Around the room, people leaned forward slightly, sensing that the confrontation was approaching some kind of resolution. Phones continued to record, and Lydia could see at least 3 people actively texting, probably sharing updates about the developing incident with friends elsewhere on the base. Santos moved closer to Lydia's position, his body language suggesting someone preparing to physically escort her from the building if necessary. "Ma'am, we need to see some identification. Military ID, veteran card, DD 214 something, that proves you have a right to be here." The demand for documentation created a new level of pressure. Unlike the earlier requests for verbal verification, this was something that could be definitively resolved. Either she could produce appropriate credentials or she couldn't. There was no middle ground for continued deflection. Rodriguez joined Santos in approaching Lydia, creating a semicircle of uniformed personnel that made the confrontation feel increasingly official. "If you can't provide documentation, we'll need to escort you off the installation," she added, her hand resting casually on her radio. "This is a security matter now." The mention of security elevated the stakes considerably. What had begun as social pressure was now becoming something that could result in official action, reports, and potentially serious consequences. Several people in the crowd looked uncomfortable with the escalation, but no one seemed willing to intervene directly in what was increasingly resembling an official military investigation. Lydia stood in the center of the growing circle, her position becoming more isolated as uniformed personnel positioned themselves around her. The physical dynamic reinforced the psychological pressure, one person standing alone against the collective authority of multiple service members. Yet her posture remained unchanged, showing neither intimidation nor aggression. "I understand your concerns," she said, her voice carrying easily despite being surrounded. "But I'm curious about something. Who exactly gave you the authority to conduct security investigations at social events?" The question struck at the heart of their improvised enforcement action. While all of them held legitimate military positions, none had been assigned any official security role for the evening's event. They were acting on assumed authority rather than actual orders, a distinction that seemed to occur to several people simultaneously. "Captain." Nolan shifted uncomfortably as he recognized the legal implications of what they were doing. Military personnel couldn't simply decide to conduct investigations on their own initiative. There were procedures, chains of command, and official protocols that governed such actions. What they were doing might technically constitute harassment or even unlawful detention. "We don't need specific authorization to protect military facilities," Thornfield replied. But her response lacked the certainty she had shown earlier. "Any service member has a responsibility to report security concerns." "Absolutely," Lydia agreed. "But there's a difference between reporting concerns and conducting investigations. One requires official authority, the other doesn't." Her distinction highlighted a crucial legal point that made several people in the crowd exchange worried glances. Military personnel who exceeded their authority could face serious consequences, especially if their actions were being recorded and could be reviewed later by actual military police or security personnel. The observation seemed to particularly Affect Santos, whose eagerness to support Thornfield was now tempered by concerns about his own position. As an NCO, he was trained to follow orders, but he was also responsible for ensuring that the orders he followed were legitimate. The line between those two principles was becoming increasingly unclear. "Look," Rodriguez said, attempting to regain momentum for their position. "This doesn't have to be complicated. If she's legitimate military, she have documentation. If she doesn't, then we know what we're dealing with." The logic seemed compelling on the surface, but it ignored the complex realities of military service that several people in the room understood. Classification levels, special operations, intelligence assignments. There were numerous legitimate reasons why someone might be reluctant to discuss their military background in detail, especially in a public setting. Lieutenant Walsh had remained quiet during the escalation, but the increasingly aggressive tone seemed to push her past her comfort level. "Ma'am," she addressed Thornfield carefully, "shouldn't we contact actual security personnel if this is really a security matter? MPs would be better equipped to handle verification procedures." The suggestion was logical and professionally appropriate, but it also represented a direct challenge to Thornfield's handling of the situation. If they involved official security personnel, they would have to explain their actions and justify their assumption something that might not reflect well on their improvised investigation. "That won't be necessary," Thornfield replied quickly, her tone suggesting that official involvement was the last thing she wanted. "We can resolve this ourselves." Her reluctance to involve official channels was telling, and several people in the crowd seemed to recognize it. If she was confident in her actions and assumptions, bringing in proper authorities should have been welcomed rather than avoided. The refusal suggested awareness that their behavior might not withstand official scrutiny. Lydia observed this exchange with interest, recognizing the tactical shift that Walsh's suggestion had created. By raising the possibility of official involvement, the young lieutenant had forced Thornfield to choose between maintaining her aggressive stance and risking actual military police review of her actions. "I think Lieutenant Walsh raises an excellent point," Lydia said calmly. "If this is truly a security matter, proper channels would be more appropriate than an informal tribunal." The comment had the effect of highlighting how far their actions had deviated from standard military procedure. Professional military operations followed established protocols. They didn't involve public confrontations at social events, conducted by personnel with no official security role. Master Sergeant Angela Brooks, who had been watching from a table near the back of the room, finally stood up and approached the group. As the senior enlisted person present, her opinion carried significant weight, and her intervention suggested that the situation was approaching a level that required more experienced judgment. "What exactly is happening here?" Brooks asked, her tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to resolving conflicts before they escalated beyond control. Her question was directed at the group generally, but her attention focused on Thornfield as the apparent leader of the confrontation. "We're verifying military credentials for someone attending a military social event," Thornfield replied, though her explanation sounded less confident when directed at someone of Brooks' experience and rank. Brooks looked around the circle, taking in the positioning of personnel around Lydia, the phones recording the encounter, and the tense atmosphere that had replaced the evening's intended social environment. Her expression suggested someone who had seen enough military investigations to recognize when procedures were being followed and when they weren't. "I see," Brooks said slowly. "And who authorized this verification procedure? What regulation are we following?" The question struck at the weakest point of their position. Military actions required regulatory basis and proper authorization, principles that every service member learned early in their training. Without those foundations, their actions were essentially vigilante enforcement with no official standing. Thornfield's pause before responding was telling. She had acted on assumption and personal authority rather than official directive, and Brooks' questions highlighted that distinction clearly. Around the room, people were beginning to understand that they might be witnessing an abuse of authority rather than a legitimate security. Action. The confrontation was reaching a critical point where continued escalation would require either backing down or committing to actions that could have serious official consequences. The informal tribunal that had formed around Lydia was discovering that their assumed authority might not survive contact with actual military procedure and oversight. The evening that had begun as a social mixer was transforming into something that could have lasting consequences for everyone involved. Master Sergeant Brooks' intervention had created a momentary pause in the confrontation, her questions about authorization and regulatory basis hanging in the air like an unresolved chord. The room remained tense, but the arrival of senior enlisted leadership had shifted the dynamic from aggressive confrontation to something approaching professional inquiry. Thornfield appeared to be calculating her next move when the recreation center's main entrance opened with the pneumatic hiss of automatic doors. The sound was barely audible over the murmur of conversations. But something about the way people near the entrance straightened. Their postures created a ripple effect that spread across the room. Military personnel developed an instinctive awareness of rank and authority, an ability to sense when someone of significant importance entered their space even before visual confirmation. Colonel Patricia Winters stepped through the entrance with the measured pace of someone accustomed to having rooms reorganize themselves around her presence. At 53, she carried her rank with the quiet confidence that came from 3 decades of progressive responsibility and multiple combat deployments. Her battle dress uniform bore the subdued insignia of someone whose career had been built on operational assignments rather than staff positions. What made Colonel Winters' arrival particularly significant was her role as the installation's deputy commander for operations, a position that gave her authority over virtually everything that happened on Fort Meridian. Her presence at a social mixer was unusual enough to suggest either personal interest or official business, and the timing of her arrival seemed too coincidental to ignore. Colonel Winters paused just inside the entrance, her experienced eyes quickly assessing the scene before her. The cluster of uniformed personnel surrounding a lone civilian, the recording devices, the tense body language, all of it painted a clear picture of some kind of incident in progress. Her expression remained neutral, but those who knew her well might have detected a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested growing concern. "Good evening," Colonel Winters said, her voice carrying easily across the now quiet room. "I was hoping to stop by and meet some of our newer personnel, but it seems like something else is happening here." The comment was delivered with the kind of careful neutrality that senior officers used when they wanted information before deciding how to respond. It wasn't quite a question, but it clearly expected an answer from someone willing to take responsibility for the situation. Thornfield recognized the implicit command in Colonel Winters' statement and moved to respond, though her earlier confidence seemed diminished by the arrival of someone with actual authority to review her actions. "Ma'am, we were conducting a verification of military credentials for someone attending a military social event." The explanation was technically accurate but left out crucial context about how the verification had developed and who had authorized it. Colonel Winters' expression suggested she was aware of these omissions, though she didn't immediately challenge them. "I see," Colonel Winters replied, her tone remaining professionally neutral. "And what prompted this verification procedure?" The question was directed at Thornfield, but Colonel Winters' attention had begun to focus on the woman standing calmly in the center of the group. There was something about Lydia's bearing that seemed to catch the colonel's interest, a quality of stillness and composure that suggested someone comfortable with high-pressure situations. "Ma'am, there were concerns about potential stolen valor," Santos interjected, apparently eager to support his superior officer. The individual in question has been unable to provide proper military credentials. Colonel Winters nodded slowly, processing this information while continuing to observe the dynamics of the situation. Her gaze moved between the various participants, noting the positioning of personnel, the presence of recording devices, and the general atmosphere of confrontation that had replaced what should have been a relaxed social environment. Has anyone attempted to verify these concerns through proper channels? Colonel Winters asked, her question highlighting the procedural issues that Master Sergeant Brooks had raised earlier. Military police, security personnel, official identification verification? The silence that followed her question was telling. Thornfield's reluctance to involve official channels had been noted by several people in the room, and Colonel Winters' inquiry brought that issue into sharp focus. Professional military operations followed. Established procedures. They didn't rely on impromptu. Investigations conducted by personnel with no official authorization. We felt it was appropriate to resolve the matter at the unit level, Thornfield replied. Though her explanation sounded increasingly weak when directed at someone with Colonel Winters' experience and authority, Colonel Winters studied Thornfield for a moment, her expression suggesting someone weighing multiple factors before responding. The concept of unit-level resolution was valid in many military contexts, but it required actual unit authority and proper procedures, neither of which appeared to be present in this situation. Lieutenant Colonel Thornfield, Colonel Winters said, using Thornfield's rank in a way that emphasized the chain of command. What regulation are we following for this verification procedure? The question struck at the heart of military accountability. Everything in military operations was supposed to be based on established regulations and procedures, and Colonel Winters was essentially asking Thornfield to cite the legal basis for her actions. The inability to provide such citation would effectively invalidate the entire confrontation. While Thornfield struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't expose the unofficial nature of her investigation, Colonel Winters turned her attention to Lydia. The shift was subtle but significant, a recognition that the woman at the center of the controversy might have her own perspective worth hearing. And you are? Colonel Winters asked, her tone carrying the respectful inquiry that senior officers used when addressing unknown personnel who might themselves hold significant rank or position. Lydia Hartwell, she replied, her voice carrying clearly despite the tension of the situation. I was invited to attend tonight's social event through the Transition Services program. The mention of transition services provided important context that had been largely ignored during the confrontation. Military transition programs served personnel who were separating from service or had recently separated individuals who had legitimate connections to the military community but might not carry current active duty identification. Colonel Winters absorbed this information with the kind of focused attention that suggested personal familiarity with transition challenges. I see. And Lieutenant Colonel Thornfield felt it necessary to verify your credentials in this manner? The question highlighted the disparity between appropriate procedures for handling transition-related questions and the aggressive public confrontation that had actually occurred. There were established channels for addressing documentation issues, and none of them involved public challenges at social events. There seemed to be some confusion about my background, Lydia replied diplomatically, her response demonstrating the kind of tactical awareness that impressed Colonel Winters. Rather than attacking Thornfield's handling of the situation, she was providing neutral information that allowed the colonel to draw her own conclusions. The exchange was being watched intently by everyone in the room, though the dynamic had shifted considerably with Colonel Winters' arrival. What had been a confrontation between Lydia and Thornfield's group was now becoming a professional inquiry conducted by someone with actual authority to resolve the situation. Master Sergeant. Brooks stepped forward slightly, apparently deciding to provide additional context. Ma'am, I arrived to find personnel conducting what appeared to be an unofficial investigation without clear regulatory basis or proper authorization. Her statement carried significant weight coming from someone of her experience and rank. Senior enlisted personnel like Brooks were often more familiar with actual regulations and procedures than junior officers, and her assessment suggested serious procedural problems with what had occurred. Colonel Winters nodded, accepting Brooks' input while continuing to assess the situation. Her experience with personnel management and military law was extensive, and she was clearly recognizing multiple issues with how the evening's events had developed. Ms. Hartwell, Colonel Winters said, turning back to Lydia with a more formal approach, would you be willing to speak with me privately about your transition services participation? I'd like to understand better how we can improve our support for personnel in similar situations. The offer was professional and respectful, treating Lydia as someone deserving of courtesy rather than suspicion. More importantly, it provided a path forward that didn't require public resolution of what had become an increasingly problematic situation. But as Colonel Winters extended the invitation, her trained eye caught something that made her pause mid-sentence. Lydia had shifted slightly while responding to questions, and the movement had caused her civilian jacket to gap open, just enough to reveal a small portion of her left shoulder area. What Colonel Winters saw there made her entire demeanor change in an instant, her professional composure giving way to something approaching shock. The partial view of fabric underneath Lydia's civilian jacket showed the edge of what appeared to be a combat patch, but not just any combat patch. The distinctive color pattern and partial design visible at the jacket's edge represented something that Colonel Winters recognized with absolute certainty. Room was still waiting for Lydia's response to the private meeting invitation, unaware that Colonel Winters had just seen something that changed everything. The recreation center fell into an unnatural silence as Colonel Winters stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the barely visible edge of fabric beneath Lydia's civilian jacket. The partial glimpse of the combat patch had triggered a recognition so profound that it temporarily overrode her professional composure. For several heartbeats, the only sound in the room was the distant hum of the ventilation system and the barely audible buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Everyone in the room could sense that something significant had occurred, though most couldn't identify what had caused the colonel's sudden stillness. Thornfield looked between Colonel Winters and Lydia with growing confusion, uncertain whether the pause was part of some disciplinary consideration or something else entirely. The phones that had been recording the confrontation continued to capture what was becoming an increasingly mysterious moment. Colonel Winters' mind raced through memories she had tried to compartmentalize for years. The patch design she had glimpsed was burned into her consciousness from briefings that had taken place in secured rooms with clearance levels most personnel would never achieve. It represented operations that officially didn't exist, conducted by units whose very names remained classified at levels that prevented normal military record keeping. Ma'am? Thornfield ventured, interpreting the colonel's silence as contemplation of appropriate disciplinary action. Should we proceed with the verification process? The question seemed to break Colonel Winters from her momentary paralysis, though her response was not what anyone in the room expected. Instead of addressing Thornfield's inquiry, she took 2 steps closer to Lydia, her movement deliberate and unmistakably purposeful. Ms. Hartwell, Colonel Winters said, her voice carrying a new quality that suggested profound respect rather than routine courtesy. Would you mind if I asked you to remove your jacket? The request sent a ripple of surprise through the crowd. After an evening of Thornfield's group demanding verification and documentation, Having the base's deputy commander make the same request seemed to validate their aggressive approach. Several people nodded approval, apparently assuming that Colonel Winters was simply conducting the verification process with proper authority. But Lydia could see something in Colonel Winters' expression that suggested this wasn't about verification in the way the others understood it. There was recognition in the Colonel's eyes, mixed with something approaching awe. The request wasn't coming from suspicion. It was coming from someone who already knew what they would find. "Of course, ma'am," Lydia replied, her voice steady despite the significance she recognized in the moment. Her hands moved to the buttons of her civilian jacket with the same controlled precision she had maintained throughout the evening's confrontation. As she began to unbutton the jacket, the room's attention focused with laser intensity on her movements. Thornfield and her supporters appeared vindicated, expecting to see either nothing underneath or evidence of the fraudulent military appearance they had been convinced they were exposing. Master Sergeant Brooks and Lieutenant Walsh watched with the careful attention of professional soldiers trying to understand what their commander had seen that they had missed. Lydia's jacket fell open, revealing the olive drab military blouse she wore underneath. But it wasn't the uniform itself that caused the collective intake of breath from those close enough to see clearly. It was the patch positioned on her left shoulder, now fully visible under the recreation center's fluorescent lighting. The combat patch displayed a design that most of the room's occupants had never seen before, though its significance was immediately apparent to anyone with experience in special operations. The patch showed a stylized desert landscape crossed by lightning bolts, with Arabic script along the bottom edge that had been deliberately obscured by tactical modifications. Above the landscape, barely visible unless viewed from the correct angle, was the outline of a stealth aircraft that officially didn't exist in any public military inventory. Colonel Winters stared at the patch with the intensity of someone confronting a ghost from their own past. The design represented Operation Desert Lightning, a classified mission that had taken place during the height of insurgent activity in Iraq. It was an operation so deeply buried in classification that most of the personnel who had supported it were required to sign additional secrecy agreements beyond their standard security clearances. "Task Force Phantom," Colonel Winters said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of recognition and profound respect. "Desert Lightning, March 2008. The words meant nothing to most people in the room, but they hit Lydia like a physical impact. Task Force Phantom had been disbanded immediately after the operation's completion. Its members scattered to different assignments with orders never to acknowledge their service together. The fact that Colonel Winters not only recognized the patch but could name the specific operation and time frame meant she had been involved at a level that few people achieved. "You were the intelligence liaison," Lydia said, her own voice reflecting recognition. "7th floor. Green zone. You briefed us on the target facility layout." The exchange confirmed what both women had realized. They had served together on one of the most classified operations of the Iraq conflict, though their interaction had been limited to secure briefing rooms and operational planning sessions. The recognition was mutual and profound, carrying with it memories of an operation that had saved hundreds of lives while remaining completely hidden from public acknowledgement. The room had fallen into complete silence as people tried to process what they were witnessing. The casual conversation and social atmosphere of the evening had been replaced by something that felt more like a military ceremony. Though most of the observers didn't understand why Santos, who had been so eager to challenge Lydia's credentials, now stared at the patch with growing confusion. The design was clearly military, clearly combat-related, and clearly something he had never seen before in his 8 years of service. His training told him that patches he didn't recognize might be more significant than patches he did, especially when they prompted this kind of reaction from a full colonel. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said carefully, her voice reflecting uncertainty about what was happening. "I'm not familiar with that unit designation." Colonel Winters turned to address the group, her demeanor shifting into the educational mode that senior officers used when explaining complex military concepts to junior personnel. Task Force Phantom was a joint special operations unit that conducted highly classified missions during the Iraq conflict. The operations were classified at levels that prevented normal unit recognition or public acknowledgement. The explanation provided context that began to make sense of the evening's events. Lydia's reluctance to discuss her military background wasn't evidence of fraud. It was evidence of service so classified that normal verification procedures didn't apply. Her careful responses to questions about units and assignments weren't evasions, they were adherence to security protocols that remained in effect years after her separation from service. Thornfield stood frozen as the implications of Colonel Winters' explanation became clear. Her aggressive challenge to Lydia's credentials hadn't exposed stolen valor. It had publicly confronted a veteran whose service was classified at levels that Thornfield herself lacked the clearance to access. The irony was overwhelming and professionally devastating. "The individuals who served with Task Force Phantom," Colonel Winters continued, her voice carrying the weight of official pronouncement, "were specifically instructed never to discuss their service publicly due to ongoing security considerations. Their reluctance to provide normal verification isn't suspicious. It's following direct orders that remain in effect." Master Sergeant Brooks nodded slowly as understanding dawned. She had suspected from the beginning that there were procedural problems with the confrontation, but she hadn't realized that they were dealing with classification levels that made normal verification impossible. The aggressive challenge to Lydia's credentials hadn't just been inappropriate, had potentially compromised ongoing security protocols. Lieutenant Walsh looked between Colonel Winters and Lydia with growing comprehension of how badly the evening had gone wrong. Her earlier attempts to suggest more appropriate procedures had been motivated by general discomfort with the confrontation. But now she realized she had been trying to prevent a much more serious breach of military protocol and security. The phones that had been recording the confrontation now represented a potential security issue rather than documentation of stolen valor exposure. Colonel Winters would need to address the recordings and ensure that classified information didn't spread beyond the room. Though the damage to Lydia's privacy and security had already been done. As the full scope of the situation became clear, the room's atmosphere shifted from confrontational tension to something approaching horror among those who realized what they had witnessed. They hadn't exposed fraud, they had forced a classified operations veteran to reveal protected information in a public setting, potentially compromising security protocols that had been established to protect both personnel and national interests. The recognition moment that Thornfield's group had expected to vindicate their aggressive approach had instead revealed them as the perpetrators of a serious breach of military protocol and security procedure. Colonel Winters surveyed the room with the measured assessment of a senior officer who had just witnessed a significant breach of military protocol. The recognition between herself and Lydia had fundamentally altered the nature of what everyone had assumed they were observing, and the implications were far more serious than a simple case of mistaken identity or procedural error. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Winters announced, her voice carrying the authority that commanded immediate attention from every person in the recreation center. "What you have witnessed tonight represents a serious compromise of operational security protocols that have been in place for over 15 years. The gravity in her tone made it clear that this was no longer a social situation but an official military matter, requiring immediate attention. Several people who had been recording the confrontation began to look uncomfortable as they realized their documentation might now constitute a security violation rather than evidence of stolen valor exposure. Task Force Phantom was established in 2007 under the Joint Special Operations Command to conduct high-value target elimination and intelligence gathering operations in Iraq. Colonel Winters continued, providing context that helped explain the extraordinary secrecy surrounding Lydia's service. The unit's existence was classified at compartmentalized levels that prevented normal military record-keeping and veteran services processing. She gestured toward Lydia, who remained standing with her jacket open, the combat patch now fully visible to everyone in the room. Captain Hartwell, and yes, that was her rank during service, was assigned to Task Force Phantom as a tactical intelligence specialist and direct action operator. Her role required infiltration of insurgent networks in Baghdad and Fallujah during the height of sectarian violence. The explanation provided a framework for understanding why Lydia's reluctance to discuss her service had been so absolute. Special operations personnel, particularly those involved in classified direct action missions, were bound by security oaths that remained in effect long after their separation from active duty. Her careful deflection of questions hadn't been evasion, it had been adherence to legal obligations that carried serious criminal penalties for violation. Santos stood frozen as the implications of his earlier demands became clear. His insistence on documentation and verification had essentially been asking Lydia to commit federal crimes by revealing classified information. The irony was devastating. His attempt to protect military integrity had actually pressured a legitimate veteran to violate the very security protocols that protected military operations. The March 2008 operation that Captain Hartwell participated in, Colonel Winters continued, prevented a coordinated suicide bombing campaign that intelligence indicated would have targeted civilian markets in Baghdad. The operation resulted in the elimination or capture of 17 high-value targets and the seizure of explosive materials intended for use against non-combatants. Master Sergeant Brooks absorbed this information with the professional understanding of someone who had spent decades in military service. Special operations personnel often carried the burden of achievements that could never be publicly acknowledged, serving with distinction while remaining invisible to the recognition systems that honored more conventional military service. The operational security requirements for Task Force Phantom personnel included specific prohibitions against revealing unit affiliation, mission details, or even acknowledgement of service during certain time periods, Colonel Winters explained. These restrictions were implemented to protect both the individuals involved and the ongoing effectiveness of similar operations. Lieutenant Walsh felt a wave of vindication for her earlier attempts to suggest more appropriate procedures. Her instinct that there might be legitimate reasons for someone to avoid discussing their military service publicly had been correct, though she hadn't imagined the classification levels that were actually involved. Rodriguez looked between Colonel Winters and Lydia with growing comprehension of the professional disaster that had unfolded. Her training as a military police officer had emphasized the importance of proper procedures and regulatory compliance, but she had been swept up in Thornfield's aggressive approach without applying those principles to the situation at hand. Captain Hartwell's separation from active duty in 2010 was processed through specialized channels that maintained her classification restrictions, Colonel Winters continued. Her transition to civilian status did not eliminate her security obligations or create any requirement for her to reveal protected information to verify her military credentials. The explanation addressed the fundamental misunderstanding that had driven the evening's confrontation. Thornfield's group had operated on the assumption that legitimate military service should be easily verifiable through standard documentation. But they had encountered someone whose service was specifically designed to remain unverifiable through normal channels. Thornfield herself remained silent, though the color had drained from her face as she processed the magnitude of her error. Her aggressive challenge to Lydia's credentials hadn't exposed fraud. It had forced the public revelation of information that was supposed to remain classified. The professional consequences for such a breach could be severe, particularly given her rank and the public nature of the incident. The combat patch that Captain Hartwell wears represents authorization granted to Task Force Phantom personnel upon completion of their classified service. Colonel Winters explained, providing details that helped the room understand the significance of what they had seen. These patches were manufactured in limited quantities and issued only to individuals who met specific operational criteria. During their deployment, the patch itself told a story that most people in the room were only now beginning to understand. The desert landscape represented the operational environment. The lightning bolts symbolized. Colonel Winters surveyed the room with the measured assessment of a senior officer who had just witnessed a significant breach of military protocol. The recognition between herself and Lydia had fundamentally altered the nature of what everyone had assumed they were observing, and the implications were far more serious than a simple case of mistaken identity or procedural error. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Winters announced, her voice carrying the authority that commanded immediate attention from every person in the recreation center. "What you have witnessed tonight represents a serious compromise of operational security protocols that have been in place for over 15 years. The gravity in her tone made it clear that this was no longer a social situation but an official military matter, requiring immediate attention. Several people who had been recording the confrontation began to look uncomfortable as they realized their documentation might now constitute a security violation rather than evidence of stolen valor exposure. Task Force Phantom was established in 2007 under the Joint Special Operations Command to conduct high-value target elimination and intelligence gathering operations in Iraq. Colonel Winters continued, providing context that helped explain the extraordinary secrecy surrounding Lydia's service. The unit's existence was classified at compartmentalized levels that prevented normal military record-keeping and veteran services processing. She gestured toward Lydia, who remained standing with her jacket open, the combat patch now fully visible to everyone in the room. Captain Hartwell, and yes, that was her rank during service, was assigned to Task Force Phantom as a tactical intelligence specialist and direct action operator. Her role required infiltration of insurgent networks in Baghdad and Fallujah during the height of sectarian violence. The explanation provided a framework for understanding why Lydia's reluctance to discuss her service had been so absolute. Special operations personnel, particularly those involved in classified direct action missions, were bound by security oaths that remained in effect long after their separation from active duty. Her careful deflection of questions hadn't been evasion, it had been adherence to legal obligations that carried serious criminal penalties for violation. Santos stood frozen as the implications of his earlier demands became clear. His insistence on documentation and verification had essentially been asking Lydia to commit federal crimes by revealing classified information. The irony was devastating. His attempt to protect military integrity had actually pressured a legitimate veteran to violate the very security protocols that protected military operations. The March 2008 operation that Captain Hartwell participated in, Colonel Winters continued, prevented a coordinated suicide bombing campaign that intelligence indicated would have targeted civilian markets in Baghdad. The operation resulted in the elimination or capture of 17 high-value targets and the seizure of explosive materials intended for use against non-combatants. Master Sergeant Brooks absorbed this information with the professional. The statement served as both explanation and rebuke, making it clear that the evening's confrontation had targeted exactly the kind of person who deserved respect and support, rather than suspicion and public challenge. The irony was profound. Those who claimed to be protecting military honor had actually attacked someone whose service exemplified the highest levels of military dedication and sacrifice. As the full scope of the situation became apparent, the recreation center had transformed from a social venue into something resembling a security briefing room, with everyone present now implicated in a classification incident that would require official resolution and potentially serious consequences for those involved. The weight of Colonel Winter's explanation settled over the recreation center like a heavy blanket, transforming the atmosphere from confrontational tension to something approaching collective shame. The reality of what had transpired was becoming clear to everyone present. They had witnessed, and in many cases participated in, the public humiliation of a decorated veteran whose service had been far more significant than anyone in the room had imagined. Lieutenant Colonel Thornfield stood motionless, her face pale as the professional implications of her actions became inescapable. As the senior officer who had initiated and led the aggressive confrontation, she bore primary responsibility for what Colonel Winters had characterized as a serious breach of operational security protocols. The recordings that documented her demands for verification had captured her pressuring a classified operations veteran to violate federal security laws. "Ma'am," Thornfield said finally, her voice barely above a whisper as she addressed Colonel Winters, "I need to apologize for my actions tonight. I acted without proper authority and created a situation that compromised operational security. The apology was professionally appropriate, but carried the hollow ring of words spoken too late to prevent serious consequences." Colonel Winters studied Thornfield with the measured assessment of a senior officer evaluating the scope of a subordinate's professional failure. "Lieutenant Colonel Thornfield," Colonel Winters replied, her tone carrying the formality that indicated official rather than personal communication. "Your actions tonight violated multiple regulations regarding the handling of classified personnel and information. This will require a formal investigation and potential administrative action." The pronouncement sent a chill through the room as people realized they were witnessing the beginning of what could be career-ending consequences for a field-grade officer. Military careers could be destroyed by single incidents of poor judgment, particularly when they involve security violations and public spectacles that reflected poorly on the service. Santos stepped forward, his earlier enthusiasm for supporting Thornfield's investigation now replaced by obvious distress. "Ma'am, I participated in the confrontation. I demanded documentation and supported the verification process. If Lieutenant Colonel Thornfield faces consequences, I should as well." His willingness to accept responsibility demonstrated the kind of integrity that military service was supposed to develop, though it also highlighted how quickly good soldiers could be led astray by poor leadership and group dynamics. Colonel Winters nodded acknowledgement of his statement while continuing to assess the situation. "Staff Sergeant Santos," Colonel Winters said, "your participation will be noted in any formal review, but your willingness to acknowledge responsibility for your actions reflects well on your character. However, the primary responsibility lies with the senior officer who initiated and directed the confrontation." Rodriguez joined Santos in stepping forward, her military police training making her acutely aware of the legal implications of what had occurred. "Ma'am, I also participated and made statements about stolen valor and criminal prosecution. I should have recognized the procedural problems with what we were doing." The admission highlighted one of the most troubling aspects of the evening's events. Multiple experienced military personnel had been swept up in an unauthorized investigation without applying their professional training to recognize the serious procedural and legal problems with their approach. The failure to follow established procedures, Colonel Winters observed, represents a breakdown in professional military education and leadership at multiple levels. This incident will serve as a case study for improving training in classification handling and appropriate investigation procedures. Lieutenant Walsh approached the group with obvious reluctance, her earlier attempts to suggest more appropriate procedures now seeming prescient. "Ma'am, I tried to question the approach we were taking, but I should have been more forceful in my objections. I failed to prevent a serious breach of protocol." Colonel Winters studied the young lieutenant with interest, recognizing someone who had demonstrated better judgment than her more senior colleagues. "Lieutenant Walsh, your attempts to suggest proper procedures were noted and will be reflected in any formal review. Your instincts were correct, though the situation had already escalated beyond what a junior officer could reasonably be expected to control." The exchange highlighted the complex dynamics that had contributed to the confrontation. Walsh's junior rank had made it difficult for her to effectively challenge the aggressive approach being taken by senior personnel, though her attempts to do so demonstrated the kind of professional courage that military service was supposed to develop. "Master." Sergeant Brooks moved closer to Colonel Winters, her senior enlisted perspective providing valuable context for understanding how the situation had developed. "Ma'am, when I arrived, I could see that procedures weren't being followed, but the confrontation was already well established. The group dynamics had created momentum that was difficult to interrupt." Her observation identified a crucial factor in how military personnel could be led astray once aggressive action was initiated by apparent authority figures. It became increasingly difficult for individuals to step back and apply proper procedures. The phenomenon was well documented in military psychology but had played out in real time at the evening social mixer. Colonel Winters turned her attention to the broader group of personnel who had witnessed and in some cases supported the confrontation. "Those of you who recorded these events, either through phones or other devices, need to understand that you have documented the forced revelation of classified information. These recordings cannot be shared or distributed without violating federal security laws." The warning created immediate concern among several people who had been filming what they expected to become a viral video exposing stolen valor. Instead, they now possessed recordings that could implicate them in security violations if handled improperly. The irony was complete. Their attempt to document fraud had actually captured their own participation in a security breach. All recordings of tonight's events will need to be turned over to appropriate security personnel for review and potential classification. Colonel Winters continued, "Failure to comply with this requirement could result in serious legal consequences for anyone involved." Captain Nolan looked visibly uncomfortable as he realized the implications for his own involvement in the confrontation. His intelligence background should have made him more sensitive to classification issues, but he had been influenced by group dynamics and apparent senior leadership rather than applying his professional knowledge. "Ma'am," Nolan said, "I supported the verification process based on what I thought was appropriate leadership from Lieutenant Colonel Thornfield. I should have recognized the potential classification implications and questioned the approach." Colonel Winters nodded, acknowledge in his statement while continuing to assess the various levels of responsibility among the participants. Captain Nolan, your intelligence training should have made you more aware of the potential for classification issues. This incident highlights the need for better integration of security awareness into all military training, not just specialized programs. The systematic acknowledgement of failures at multiple levels was creating a comprehensive picture of how military personnel could collectively lose sight of proper procedures when influenced by aggressive leadership and group dynamics. The evening's events would likely become a case study in military schools for years to come. Lydia had remained quiet during the succession of apologies and acknowledgments of responsibility, her expression showing neither satisfaction nor anger at the accountability being demonstrated around her. Her focus seemed to be on observing how the military system was processing the incident rather than on personal vindication. Captain Hartwell, Colonel Winters said, addressing Lydia directly, I want to personally apologize for the treatment you received tonight. The actions of these personnel do not reflect the respect and support that should be provided to all veterans, particularly those who served in classified operations. The apology from someone of Colonel Winters' rank carried significant weight, representing official acknowledgement that Lydia had been wronged by the system that should have protected her. More importantly, it established a foundation for addressing the ongoing challenges she faced in accessing appropriate veteran services. The classification issues that have prevented you from receiving proper veteran services support, Colonel Winters continued, will be addressed through appropriate channels. I will personally ensure that specialized services are made available to help resolve your documentation and benefits challenges. The promise of practical assistance represented more than symbolic recognition. It offered concrete steps toward resolving the bureaucratic nightmare that had been complicating Lydia's transition to civilian life for years. The evening's traumatic confrontation might ultimately lead to improvements in how the military system supported veterans with similar classification challenges. As the immediate accountability discussions concluded, the recreation center had transformed from a social venue into something resembling the aftermath of a military investigation. The careers of several personnel hung in the balance, security protocols had been compromised, and the fundamental assumptions about military, community, and veteran support had been challenged in ways that would require systematic reevaluation. The evening that had begun as a casual social mixer would end with formal investigations, administrative actions, and policy reviews that would affect military procedures for years to come. 6 months after the incident at Fort Meridian's Recreation Center, the installation had implemented sweeping changes to its procedures for handling veteran services and classification-related issues. The evening that had begun as a social mixer and evolved into a security breach had become a catalyst for reforms that extended far beyond the boundaries of a single military base. Captain Lydia Hartwell walked through the same entrance she had used on that October evening, but the circumstances of her return were dramatically different. This time, she wore her dress blue uniform with all authorized decorations clearly displayed, including the newly declassified Task Force Phantom combat patch that had caused such controversy months earlier. The Department of Defense had conducted a comprehensive review of classification policies and determined that certain special operations insignia could be partially declassified to allow proper recognition for veteran service. Recreation Center buzzed with activity as personnel prepared for the evening's event, a ceremony recognizing veterans who had faced challenges accessing appropriate services due to classification restrictions. Lydia's case had highlighted systematic problems in how the military supported personnel whose service records were affected by security requirements. leading to the establishment of specialized transition programs designed to address these unique circumstances. Colonel Winters approached from across the room, her expression showing the satisfaction of someone who had successfully navigated complex bureaucratic and security challenges to achieve meaningful reform. The months following the October incident had been intensive, requiring coordination between multiple agencies to develop new procedures that balance security requirements with appropriate veteran support. "Captain Hartwell," Colonel Winters said, extending her hand in greeting. "Thank you for agreeing to speak tonight. Your willingness to share your experience within appropriate security parameters has been instrumental in developing these new programs." Lydia accepted the handshake, her demeanor reflecting the confidence that came from finally receiving the recognition and support that had been denied for years. The specialized services that Colonel Winters had promised had proven effective, resolving documentation issues that had prevented access to medical care and disability benefits. More importantly, the new programs would ensure that other veterans facing similar challenges would have established procedures for receiving appropriate assistance. "It's an honor to be here, ma'am," Lydia replied. "If sharing my experience helps prevent other veterans from facing similar challenges, then something positive will have come from what happened in October." The transformation in her circumstances had been comprehensive. The VA benefits that had been denied for years due to classification issues were now approved and retroactive. The medical treatment she needed for injuries sustained during her Task Force Phantom service were finally available through specialized providers who had appropriate security clearances. Most importantly, her service was now officially recognized within the limitations that security requirements allowed. Lieutenant Walsh approached their conversation with obvious respect for both officers, her role in the October incident attempting to suggest more appropriate procedures had been noted favorably in the subsequent investigation, and had led to her assignment as liaison officer for the new Veteran Classification Support Program. "Ma'am, the attendees are ready for tonight's presentation," Walsh reported to Colonel Winters. "We have representatives from multiple installations who are interested in implementing similar programs at their bases." The evening ceremony represented more than recognition for individual veterans. It marked the beginning of systematic changes to how the military addressed the complex intersection of security requirements and veteran services. The lessons learned from Lydia's case were being institutionalized into training programs and policy changes that would affect military operations for years to come. As they moved toward the presentation area, Lydia noticed Staff Sergeant Santos among the evening's attendees. His participation in the October confrontation had resulted in formal counseling and additional training on classification procedures. But his willingness to accept responsibility for his actions had prevented more serious consequences. He approached with obvious nervousness, clearly uncertain about how to interact with someone he had previously challenged so aggressively. "Ma'am," Santos said, addressing Lydia with the respect he should have shown months earlier, "I wanted to thank you for not filing formal complaints about my behavior in October. I learned from that experience, and it's made me a better soldier." Lydia studied him for a moment, recognizing genuine remorse and professional growth. "Staff Sergeant Santos, what happened that night was a failure of procedures and training, not individual malice. The important thing is that we've all learned from it and worked to ensure it doesn't happen again." Her response demonstrated the kind of leadership and grace that had characterized her throughout the ordeal. Rather than seeking personal vindication or revenge, she had focused on systemic improvements that would benefit other veterans facing similar challenges. The maturity of her approach had been noted by senior leadership and had contributed to the comprehensive nature of the reforms that followed. Sergeant Brooks joined their conversation, her role in questioning the October procedures having led to her assignment as senior enlisted advisor for the new classification support programs. Her experience and professional judgment had proven valuable in developing training that would help military personnel recognize and appropriately handle classification-related issues. Captain Hartwell. Brooks said, "I've been working with the training development team to incorporate your case study into our professional military education curriculum, with appropriate security modifications, of course. The goal is to ensure that what happened in October never happens again." The systematic approach to preventing similar incidents represented one of the most positive outcomes of the confrontation. Rather than treating it as an isolated failure, military leadership had recognized it as evidence of broader procedural gaps that required comprehensive solutions. The training programs that resulted would improve how military personnel handled classification issues across multiple contexts. The ceremony began with Colonel Winters providing context for the evening's recognition event. She explained how classification requirements, while necessary for national security, could create unintended consequences for the veterans who had served in the most sensitive operations. The new programs being established would ensure that these veterans received appropriate support without compromising security requirements. "The individuals we recognize tonight," Colonel Winters told the assembled crowd, "represent the complexity of military service in an era where some of our most important operations must remain classified. Their willingness to serve in shadows and their patience in dealing with the bureaucratic challenges that secrecy creates exemplifies the highest traditions of military service." When Lydia was called forward to receive formal recognition for her Task Force Phantom service, the applause was genuine and sustained. The audience understood that they were witnessing the correction of a historical oversight recognition that should have been provided years earlier but had been prevented by classification requirements and bureaucratic failures. Captain Hartwell's service with Task Force Phantom, Colonel Winters announced, prevented terrorist attacks that would have cost hundreds of civilian lives. Her willingness to operate in extremely dangerous environments, combined with her post-service patience in dealing with classification-related challenges, represents the best of American military service. The citation that accompanied her recognition was carefully crafted to acknowledge her achievements without revealing operational details that remained classified. It represented a new approach to honoring classified service, finding ways to provide appropriate recognition while maintaining necessary security restrictions. During her brief remarks to the audience, Lydia focused on the lessons learned from her experience and the importance of the systematic changes being implemented. "The challenges I faced were not unique," she said. "There are veterans across the country who have served in classified operations and are struggling to access the services they've earned. The programs being established here represent hope that these challenges can be resolved through appropriate procedures and training." Her comments highlighted the broader significance of the evening's event. While her individual case had been resolved, the systemic problems that created her difficulties affected numerous other veterans. The Fort Meridian programs were being designed as models that could be replicated at other installations and eventually implemented throughout the military system. As the evening concluded, the transformation that had resulted from the October confrontation was evident in multiple ways. Personnel who had participated in the aggressive challenge to Lydia's credentials now understood the complexity of classification issues and the importance of following proper procedures. New training programs would ensure that future military personnel were better prepared to handle similar situations. Appropriately, Lieutenant Colonel Thornfield had requested transfer to a different installation following the investigation of her actions, though the formal consequences had been limited to counseling and additional training. Her aggressive approach had been recognized as a failure of judgment rather than malicious intent. But the incident had effectively ended her prospects for further promotion and advancement. The recording devices that had documented the confrontation had been properly handled through security channels, with the footage being used as training material for the new classification awareness programs. What had been intended as documentation of stolen valor exposure had instead become educational content about the importance of proper procedures and respect for all veterans. As Lydia prepared to leave the recreation center, she reflected on the irony that her most traumatic post-service experience had ultimately led to the most positive developments in her transition to civilian life. The confrontation that had forced the unwanted revelation of her classified service had also created the momentum for systematic changes that would benefit countless other veterans facing similar challenges. Woman who walked out of Fort Meridian that evening was no longer caught between worlds, no longer forced to choose between following security protocols and accessing veteran services. She had become an advocate for systemic change and a symbol of how military communities could better support all of their veterans, regardless of the classification restrictions that might complicate their service records. The transformation was complete, not just for Lydia, but for the military system that had failed her and then learned from that failure to become better. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.